Despite all his rage, he's still just Nicolas Cage. Despite all his rage, he's still just Nicolas Cage. And someone will say his career can never be saved. Despite all his rage, he's still just Nicolas Cage. Hey guys, time for another episode of Just Nicolas Cage, where I very slowly work my way through Nicolas Cage's filmography. Today I'm talking about the 1986 movie Peggy Sue Got Married. Peggy Sue Got Married takes place in 1985, where Kathleen Turner's character Peggy Sue passes out at her high school reunion. And she wakes up in 1960 where everybody sees her as a teenager, but she has the same personality and memories as she did when she was an adult. So you might be thinking, okay, a movie set in the 80s where somebody accidentally goes back in time 25 years into the past. Isn't that a little bit similar to Back to the Future? And yeah, they do both kind of have similar premises, but the execution of the two films are quite different. This movie is kind of a more personal, introspective kind of take on the whole time travel thing. This isn't a story about somebody who goes back in time and they're like a fish out of water, bumbling with their parents and stuff. Peggy Sue is actually reliving her life, but with the sensibilities of an adult. It's a fun idea, like, would you do things differently if you had the chance? It kind of poses the question of, like, do the bad decisions that you've made in the past kind of make you who you are? And I'm often reminiscent about high school and what I would have done differently, so the premise of this quite appealed to me. It is kind of funny, though, to think about the trend of 80s movies that paid tribute to the 50s. And obviously it was because a lot of the filmmakers in the 80s grew up in the 50s. It's kind of like how these days movies and shows have like vibes and soundtracks of the 1980s. It kind of makes you wonder, like in 10 years time, are there going to be like love letters to the 2010s where it's like, oh look, it's the Black Eyed Peas, remember them? Anyway, never mind all that rubbish. I gotta talk about the big man himself, Nicolas Cage. And oh boy, is there a lot to talk about Nicolas Cage here today. So Nicolas Cage plays the guy that Kathleen Turner eventually marries, has a kid with, and inevitably separates from. But back in the 60s, Cage is still her boyfriend and a teenager. Now Kathleen Turner is trying to break up the relationship early on, but Nicolas Cage is still in love with her, so that's a whole big dilemma. But I gotta talk about Nicolas Cage's voice. His voice is so weird. It sounds like, oh, he talks like this. Hello there. Oh.
You mean my Huang?
So apparently it was Nicolas Cage's idea 100% to do this voice. Apparently he just showed up to set one day talking like that, and Francis Ford Coppola was like, hey, what the hell are you doing? And Nicolas Cage wouldn't stop, so, you know, they just let him do it. I read that the voice was based on a character called Pokey from the show Gumby, but it kind of reminds me of Professor Frink from The Simpsons a little bit. Honestly, I'm kind of torn about this voice. It's weird, and it's distracting, and it makes his whole character feel so goofy and weird. But on the other hand, it's a pretty damn funny voice. The delivery of his lines made me laugh quite a lot. There's a really great part where Nicolas Cage is getting upset and his voice kind of cracks like a duck.
Did you give it one more chance? I'm thinking, did we break up? Did we break up?
I think ultimately his weird voice made this movie more memorable. Cage's character is actually quite interesting, because they set up quite early that he's a bad guy that cheated on Peggy Sue. And there's a really weird part where Nicolas Cage breaks into Peggy Sue's house and he's creeping like this, and then he gets up to her while she's asleep, gets a pillow, about to smother her, and it's just like never addressed, it's just played for laughs. He was about to murder her. But I never hated him as a character, and I think it's because of the voice. That goofy voice just makes him not seem as bad. And Cage really did bring a vulnerable, sympathetic vibe to this character, in a weird way that kind of only Nicolas Cage could have pulled off. Kathleen Turner, who plays the lead in this, was very good too. She was actually nominated for an Oscar for the role. Her central emotional performance really grounds the movie, and from a lot of the interviews I've read, it seems like she had to put up with a lot of nonsense from Nicolas Cage off camera, so fair play for that. Jim Carrey, of all people, is actually in this movie too. I think it was very early in his career, I don't think he'd really made it. But he's still very Jim Carrey-ish. He's got all the Jim Carrey facial expressions that you know, and he's throwing out one-liners that are obviously improvised. There's actually a really, really entertaining doo-wop number with Nicolas Cage and Jim Carrey and two other guys. So this movie was directed by Francis Ford Coppola, and it's the third and final film that he directed that featured his nephew Nicolas Cage. The direction and cinematography in this are quite good. In particular, I was very impressed by the opening and closing shots of the film, in which the camera seems to pan through a mirror. After you've concentrated on it for a couple of seconds, you realize what's really going on. They've obviously got a double on the other side replicating the actions to create an illusion of a mirror. But it's still a nice little trick that was done practically. Nowadays, that would easily be done in CGI. So the movie's not without its flaws. There's a lot of suspension of disbelief that you gotta go through. Because it's one of those movies where you're meant to be looking at teenagers, but it's people in their 20s and 30s. At least with Kathleen Turner, there's the whole gimmick where okay, we're seeing her as an adult, but everybody else is seeing her as a teenager, so you can kind of get through it like that. But then you got people like Bob from That 70s Show playing a teenager, and it looks ridiculous. But the biggest problem with the film is the third act. The way they resolve the whole time travel thing just feels like a mess, very shoehorned. It involves some nonsense in a lodge founded by a time traveler with all these old people that are Freemasons. And it just comes out of nowhere. It feels so weird. I also think the story just wraps up a little too neatly. And I didn't really like the way Peggy Sue's character arc ended. It kind of felt like she didn't even really learn anything. I was hoping for something a little bit more bittersweet, and I think that would have fit the vibe of the movie better. Overall though, I like this movie. It's fun, it's weird, it's quirky. I like the whole 50s vibe to it with the Buddy Holly and stuff like that. It's not an amazing movie by any means, but yeah, it's fun for what it is. I recommend the movie if you like these kind of high school rom-coms, a bit of time travel, or if you just want to hear Nicolas Cage sound like a cartoon character. Next up is Raising Arizona, which I'm quite excited about because it's the first one so far that I've actually seen before, but I haven't seen it since I was like 16. So until next time, thanks for watching, guys.